Hello and welcome to week one of American government. Before we get started at looking at how our government's actually structured, we're going to spend some time looking at some philosophy and some other things that underpin our system of government. As I said, we're going to look at some basic questions, really kind of taking apart the idea of government, what it is and what it does before we get into more detail. We're also going to look at the philosophies that underpin government. That really drives how we structure government and why it is the way that it is. So we're going to spend most of the class looking at the nuts and bolts of how our government is actually put together. Before we do that, though, we're going to spend some time looking at why it's put together the way that it is. What were people thinking when they came up with the plan that we call the Constitution? I think, there's probably some basic knowledge you have from high school or wherever, like we have 3 branches of government. Okay, well, that's great. Why didn't they make 1 branch? Why didn't they make 20 branches? If we don't know what they were thinking, understand the philosophy that they had in mind, we're really never going to understand the why. And I think the why is just as important as the what and even the how. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at some very basic questions of what is a government, why do we need a government, and some ideas that folks have had over time over how the government ought to be put together. Before we go any further, it's probably smart of us to define what government actually is. One definition is it's a set of formal rules and institutions that make binding decisions for people in a particular area. In other words, government is what makes and enforces the rules that we all live by. If we didn't have government, we would have chaos, we'd have anarchy, we'd have caveman rules where people are, the strong would survive and, the weak would perish and that kind of thing. So basically it's the entity that makes the rules that we live our lives by that allow civilization to function. It is both a set of laws and a set of institutions. So it's a set of rules that we call laws, but it's also the institutions, things like Congress, the presidency is an institution, not just a person, the court system, those kinds of things that actually carry out those functions of turning those laws into enforceable rules that people can be punished if they break. One good point to make is that we deal with this every day. We are always interacting with government. We may not always realize it, but if you drove to school today or somewhere else, you would have seen speed limit signs. You might have run into a highway patrolman. Of course, that's the government. The planes flying overhead are controlled by the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. That's the government. The radio and TV stations you might have been listening or watching. Those are controlled by the Federal Communications Commission, which is a branch of the federal government. So the government is really all around us, administering these rules that we deal with all the time. One footnote before we go any further is the difference between government and politics. Government's a set of laws and institutions that make up the rules, basically. Politics is a little bit different, and that describes the process by which people put out ideas on how the government ought to function, try to argue about those ideas with people who have different ideas. They try to win elections. They try to be put into office and those sorts of things. So it's really 2 different processes. Government is kind of permanent in the sense that it's a set of institutions that are it's always there. It's always enforcing those laws. Politics just is the process by which we determine who's in charge of the government. So a little bit different, very interrelated, but we'll deal with both of these topics throughout the course. Well, we've talked about what government is. Why do we need it? Well, simply put, governments provide artificial restraints on society in order to bring about order, predictability, and certainty. Just think about what would happen if we didn't have any kind of government. Maybe some people would behave themselves, but there'd be no one to force them to. And so the people who had evil in their hearts would reign free. And so they could be running around raping and pillaging and stealing, and there'd be nobody to stop them. There would be no police to call. There would be no army to fight off foreign invasions. There would be really chaos. That's all there would be, is chaos. People would be living by caveman rules, and might makes right, and there would be nobody to stop any of that from happening. So government's main job is to provide for the safety and security of its citizens. That's very basic to what government does. And as we said, without some kind of restraint on people's evil impulses, there would be nothing to stop people by living by caveman rules. So very primitive, and just anarchy and chaos would be the rule of the day. Simply put, civilization requires government. If we're going to have a civilized society, we're going to have some kind of mechanism in place to create rules and to enforce those rules for everyone to live by. Otherwise, somebody will do something bad and everything will start to come apart. So without somebody minding the store there, making sure everyone is coloring within the lines or whatever, we're going to have chaos. And so if we're going to have a civilized society, we have to have some kind of restraint on people's darker nature. We have to have rules in place. We have someone to enforce those rules, and that's the job of the government, is to provide that order, predictability, and certainty that we need for civilization itself to function. Well, as we said, predictability and certainty must be provided by the government. Well, why do we have to have those things? Well, having predictability and certainty in our lives allows us to plan for the future. And to give you an example of what it would look like if we didn't have predictability and certainty, we don't have to go too far. If we go back to Iraq, circa 2004, a year or so after the American invasion and the Iraq War, if you had a living memory of those times, or even have heard about it or whatever, you'll know that Iraq was chaos during that time. America invaded, took out the government that was there, Saddam Hussein, tried to set up a new government, but people weren't paying attention to it, and Iraq broke down into ethnic groups and factions and things, and there was really no one in charge. There was no one to provide that predictability and certainty. And so you never knew if you lived in Baghdad, getting up one day, that might be your last, because there were bombings going on, there were shootings, there were terrible crimes being committed. One ethnic group was trying to wipe out other ethnic groups, and there's all kinds of chaos. Things are getting blown up every day. In an environment like that, can you imagine taking out a 30-year mortgage and trying to buy a house? Would you be willing to make that kind of investment if you didn't know if some ethnic group was going to come in and kick you out the next day, if they were going to blow up your house, if it was going to burn down, if they're going to shoot you? You can't plan for the future in a situation like that. Or, maybe not 30 years, just think about, a 5-year car loan. If your car is going to get stolen tomorrow or blown up and there's no police to call, there's no insurance, there's no any of that stuff that we just kind of automatically expect to take place. It was just chaotic. And would you spend 4 or 5 or more years going to school if you didn't know if you're going to be able to continue living in your country, if you're going to get shot the next day? In a situation like that, people don't plan for the future, they just worry about today. And if we're going to have an environment to where we have civilization, we have people doing things like creating businesses and hiring other people and building factories and doing science and teaching kids and all the stuff that we think is normal everyday life, if we're going to be doing those things, we need some kind of guarantee that the world isn't going to blow up in our face tomorrow. So that's what the government's supposed to do, is to give us that ability to plan ahead. On the other hand, though, even though government's supposed to bring us order, predictability, and certainty, sometimes we can have too much order. Well, how could we have that? Well, let's look at another example of North Korea. North Korea has very little chaos. They have lots of predictability, order, and certainty. That's because the government in North Korea controls everything. It tries to control the jobs that people have, the places that they live, the thoughts that they think. It tries to control everything. The media, TV, radio, whatever that they hear, the things that they read. It's a dictatorship that's totalitarian in nature. We'll look at what that means later. But they control every aspect of their citizens' lives. And so in North Korea, in a sense, it's a very boring place to live because there is nothing but order. Even the slightest creativity might be looked at suspiciously, because they might think, what are you doing if you're not towing the line? Everyone's supposed to be doing the same things, thinking in the same way. And so I wouldn't want to live in North Korea. They have way too much order, and there's no freedom because they have so much order. And that's an important thing to understand. Freedom and order are polar opposites. If we have nothing but order, like in North Korea, we have basically no freedom. On the other hand, in Iraq in 2004, there was no order, but there was total freedom. You could run around doing whatever you wanted to do, and there was no one to stop you from doing it. And so you can see those two locations there are kind of polar opposites. Total freedom and no order, or total order and no freedom. Well, certainly neither one of those things is what we want. But the more freedom you have, the less order you have. The more order, the less freedom. Um, and you can certainly have too much or too little of either one. And so one thing that government must do is to strike a balance between those things. We have to have a certain amount of order, or so civilization just simply can't function. If we are in an environment like Iraq in 2004, no one wants to live like that, where people run around with guns and there's no one to stop them, there's no police, there's no military, there's no order, there's no ability to plan for tomorrow because you're just trying to survive today. On the other hand, no one wants to live in North Korea either, because you have no freedom. And certainly you can have too much of either one. We want to prevent that, and that's what the government's supposed to do, is to strike a balance between those two things. Well, how does government go about providing that order, predictability, and certainty? Well, it really does it by carrying out three major tasks, which you may have heard about before in your previous academic career. If you remember the three branches of government, one of those tasks is legislating. That is defining what the rules are, coming up with the rules, writing statutes in the case of most legislatures. And we'll look about that in more detail later. But somebody has to come up with what are the rules that everyone has to follow. And that's the process of legislation. Second, the legislation really does no good unless someone is actually making sure that people are actually following the rules, and that is carrying out or enforcing the law. Somebody has to be executing those laws. Once we have them made, somebody has to make sure that everyone is actually obeying them, and that's what the process of execution is, executing the laws. The third major task is adjudication. When we adjudicate, that means we interpret and apply the laws to specific real-world situations. And we'll look at this in more detail later, but just for an example, the Eighth Amendment to our Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Well, that's very vague. What does that mean? In 1789, when that amendment was written, people were being hung for stealing horses, for example. People might be locked in stocks all day with their hands and feet in those wooden things so they couldn't move around. And that was just normal then. Well, today we look at that and say, oh, that's kind of mean. We don't want to do that. And so what does cruel and unusual mean in a particular context, at a particular time? Well, somebody has to figure that out, and that's what we have judges for. The judicial branch that adjudicates particular cases and tries to figure out, okay, well, we know that, for instance, theft is illegal, but in this particular case, did Johnny actually steal the case of beer from Walmart or whatever it is? So we have to have someone that actually looks at those particular cases and decides questions of law in those particular issues. In our system, as I said, you may remember this if you ever had a civics class before, we have three separate equal branches of government, each one of which gets to carry out one of those basic jobs. And so that's the way that the American government is structured, and every state government as well. However, not every government in the world is set up that way, and that's something that was kind of innovative and unique at the time that our Constitution was adopted. So we'll look at some different alternative arrangements and stuff before we really get into looking at our particular system of government. But just keep that in mind, not every government in the world is set up that way. Like in North Korea, for example, which we looked at a slide or two ago, pretty much the dictatorship with their Kim Jong-un controls all three branches. He does everything. So it doesn't have to be this way, but in our system of government in the United States, it's pretty basic that we separate those three main tasks. But that's what government does in order to make sure that we do have that environment of order, predictability, and certainty that the government is supposed to provide. As I said, not every government around the world is structured the same way, but no matter how it's structured, in order for a government to be able to do its job, it has to wield power. Well, what is power? Well, basically, power is the ability to get people to do something. If you're able to force people to do something they don't want to do, you have power. And all governments have power, no matter how they are structured. But that power can take different forms. How that power is concentrated and how the level of that power varies quite a bit. Let's look at some different levels of power now. At the extreme end, we have totalitarianism. And total is in there in that word, which kind of tells you that we have total power here, near total control over everything. And we keep beating up on the North Koreans, but we'll use them as our example again because they are a perfect example of a totalitarian regime. Because in North Korea, the government controls just about everything. What job you hold, where you're going to live, who you can marry, what you can think, what you can say, where you can go. All of that stuff is controlled by the government. They have total control over your life. So that's totalitarianism. Back in the days when during the Cold War, where we had the Soviet bloc, many of the communist governments were totalitarian. And so they can exercise almost total control over everything that their people thought, said, or did. A little bit less than that is an authoritarian regime. In an authoritarian regime, it's not quite as bad as a totalitarian regime, but there are it's still, they have quite a bit of power. There are a few legal limits on that power, though, and maybe some practical limitations as well. My example here is Egypt, and this is pre-2011. In 2011, there was kind of a revolution that happened in Egypt. It changed things and made the picture a little bit more muddy, but from, say, 1981, I believe it was, until 2011, Egypt was an authoritarian regime. You had a president who was in power. He was theoretically elected, but he was always elected with 99% of the vote because no one could run against him because he'd lock everyone up who might, and that sort of thing. And he basically did whatever he wanted to do because he had what were called emergency powers that gave him extraordinary abilities to push people around within that country. And the emergency that gave him those emergency powers had been going on for 30 years. He thought every day was an emergency because he really liked having that power. And so he didn't have very many legal limits on the power, but there were some practical limitations. He knew if he did too much, if he pushed the wrong people too far, he might have problems. And in fact, that's what ended up bringing him down, was that people got unhappy enough that they came out on the streets and started protesting and eventually overthrew the president there. But for about 30 years there, he exercised almost total control, but not quite. He was a little bit weaker than a real totalitarian regime. So a little bit more watered down than totalitarianism, but certainly quite a bit of power. The system that we deal with, and almost every democracy would, is a constitutional regime. In a constitutional regime, everyone, including the government and the people working for the government, such as the president, is subject to the rule of law. No one is above the law. Everyone has to answer for their actions. And our own country is an example of this. If you remember from history, or maybe you lived through that time, President Nixon, back in the early 70s, had to resign from office because it appeared that he had committed a crime. Even our president is not above the rule of law. And it controls everything, even the government itself. And there doesn't have to necessarily be a written constitution. Maybe like in Britain, they have not a written constitution at all, but just basically a set of traditions and that sort of thing. But they have basic laws that everyone has to answer to. It doesn't matter who they are or how important they are. So that's the kind of regime we have in the United States and most other democracies as well. Well, another way of looking at governments is trying to figure out how narrowly power is concentrated. Is it in the hands of one person, a group of people, or everybody? Well, when we have it in one person's hands, we might have an absolute monarchy. And that's a situation that we're familiar with from history hundreds and thousands of years ago. We would have a king or a queen who would wield almost absolute power over the country. Their word was law. If they said off with your head, it came off. Whatever they said was the law. And again, this is kind of old-fashioned, but in much of world history, we had absolute monarchies. That was kind of the norm. In the modern world, it's not the norm. Saudi Arabia is about the closest modern example I can come up with, where we have a king who has most of the power in his hands, and what he says is what happens. We do have a lot of kings and queens running around. We have Queen Elizabeth II in the United Kingdom. We have King of Norway and King of Spain and things like that. In a democracy, in the modern world, when we have a monarch like that, they're just basically a ceremonial head of state. They're what's called a constitutional monarch, to where they also have to obey the rule of law. They're not making up the law as they go. They also have to answer to the law. They have very limited powers. And so that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, like Henry VIII, who said off with his wife's head and it came off. Or from storybooks, or even the Bible in the Old Testament, think about King David, whatever he said that was the law. And he had the power of life and death over all of his subjects. So that's an absolute monarchy, and it's designed to be hereditary, and that kind of sets it apart. It's designed to be passed from father to son or daughter down the family line as far as it can go. And so that's how most of the governments in the world were based for much of world history. A more modern take on this, where we have power concentrated in the hands of one individual, is a dictatorship. Another, again, a modern example is North Korea, where we have one individual who has all the power in his hands. And a dictatorship is different from an absolute monarchy in that usually a dictatorship starts where somebody has an armed revolution or something and takes control by force of all the levers of government and concentrates all that power in their hands and is able to wipe out anyone who disagrees with them. And then they rule with absolute power, basically. It's not designed necessarily to be hereditary, although North Korea is kind of the exception to that. They pass it from father to son to grandson. But a lot of times a dictatorship only lasts one generation until the original dictator dies, and then something else comes in and replaces that dictatorship. But that's a situation, again, where we have one person who's in control of everything. Expanding the picture a little bit, we may have a group of people who run everything, a fairly small group. That's called an oligarchy, and that's a very old word that originates in ancient Greece, where some of the city-states did this. But a modern example is Myanmar, or the country of what we call Burma. And there, a junta, which is Junta, it's just a kind of a specialized term for a group of military officers usually who take over a government. There, the military basically took over the country, and a group of the high-ranking generals just started running the country. And so it's a fairly exclusive small club they have there. But it's not just one person, it's a small group of people, and they control everything. So that's an oligarchy. Instead of just having one person, we have a small group. Expanding out from that, we may have a situation called a republic. And that's what the United States actually is. It's a republic. And there we have a larger group of people who are in charge, and that group is chosen by the people as a whole. And so in the United States, we go to the polls at every election, hopefully, and we go and vote for our congressmen, we vote for senators, we may vote for the president, and we put these people into power, and then they represent us, and they take on that responsibility of governing. So they start legislating, executing the laws, and interpreting the laws, and those sorts of things. And so it's a larger group, and it's chosen by the people at large. And so that's what a republic is. In a situation where we have everybody that lives in this area having power, and we've broadened it out very broadly, we have what's called a pure democracy. And that's where basically if you live there, you have power, the power of government. And so not only is there not one person in charge or a group of people or even a large group of people, but everyone is in charge. Everyone is the government. We don't have a modern example of that, and we'll look at why, because it's kind of a bad idea here in a slide or two. But ancient Athens came very close to this, having a pure democracy where all the citizens basically were the government. And so if there was a problem that came up in Athens, they had a great big meeting, and everyone got into the stadium and talked about it and argued about it, and everyone had a vote. And so rather than delegate that, to a Congress or, a ruling class or whatever, every citizen had a voice in what happened. And so we have certainly democratic elements in our government, and we'll look at that. The people get to go to the polls and vote. They're really the root of the power, but we really do have a republic because we choose people to make the laws for us. Well, in Athens, they didn't do that. The people wrote the laws. The people are the ones that figured out what to do, if they were going to go to war with Sparta or not. That was, the people all took a vote about that, those sorts of things. So that's a pure democracy. And finally, we'll look at an anarchy. And this is really not a system of government. This is the situation where you don't have a government. A modern example would be Somalia around 2005, where there was no central government at all. There was just a bunch of people with guns running around. And the people with the most guns were the ones who told everyone else what to do. And there were different warlords and there people that were loyal to them that were fighting over the resources that were left there. And so that's a situation, again, where if we didn't have a government, we talked about how we'd live by the rules of the caveman. And that's really what happens in an anarchy. It's basically the absence of government where no one is in charge. And so everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Whatever pleases him, that's what's okay, because there's no rules, there's no one enforcing the rules, and so that's what happens. So Not a good situation, as we talked about earlier. Civilization really can't function in that environment. But so those are different ways of concentrating power, different ways of categorizing a governmental system. We tend to talk about the United States as a democracy and other enlightened nations around the world as being democracies. That's usually inaccurate. Certainly, we are built on democratic principles, but we're not a pure democracy. And we just talked about the difference between a republic and a democracy. We are a republic in the United States. We're not a true democracy. In a true democracy, everyone gets to participate in making every decision. Not just some of them, all of them. And that just wouldn't work very well. Consider what would happen if we're talking about a healthcare reform bill, for example, passing, our own version of Obamacare, okay? Well, if we're in a pure democracy, we wouldn't have Congress working on that, or even the president. We'd have everyone working on that. So if you can imagine, if we had a meeting space large enough for every American to get together to discuss this, all 200 million of us, to get together and try to write this bill, discuss it, its pros and cons. Everyone would have the ability to, insert whatever they wanted. We get to talk about it as long as everyone had something to talk about, and then we get to vote on it, and all 200 million of us would get to vote on this bill. You can imagine how cumbersome that would be. I don't even know if, even with modern technology, if we could really do that, if we could have a town hall meeting with 250 million or 300 million people involved in it. It's just not practical to have everyone involved in making every single decision. Our government really just couldn't function that way. And for two main reasons. We already alluded to one of them, but true democracy is too cumbersome. It works on a small scale. Like if you have a group of 5 friends that say are going out on a Friday night, and you're talking about, do we go mini golf or do we go to the casino? Okay, 2 of them vote for mini golf and 3 votes for let's go to the casino, so all 5 go to the casino. Okay, that's true democracy in action. It works okay with small groups, but if you're talking about 300 million people, it's just not going to work that well, because everyone basically has to have their say, and we have to come to some kind of consensus, or at least be able to take a vote on everything. And it just wouldn't work. As a silly example, imagine what if the Canadians turned against us and started invading the United States, and we had a true democracy. Okay, well, the Canadians start pouring across the border in Minnesota or Michigan or somewhere, and we get together and like, oh no, we need to talk about this. All 300 million of us have to have a meeting and decide, do we want to fight back or not, and how do we fight back, and where do we go? And what different army units are we going to attack Toronto with, and all this kind of stuff. And before we got anything even really started talking about, the Canadians would already be in Texas. So it just is too cumbersome to really work when you have a large group of people in a modern situation. So true democracy is just too cumbersome to work real well. Also, our founding fathers were afraid of this, that government by all of the people might be too radical and unstable. There might not be enough order and certainty. And certainly, if you ever pay attention to the news, or a lot of times they'll take opinion polls and try to figure out what people are thinking about a particular topic or a particular political candidate or something like that. And you can see that those numbers go up and down quite a bit. People will change their minds sometimes for little or no reason at all. Maybe they're not really paying that much attention. They haven't really thought things through. And so on one day you ask, well, what do you think of Barack Obama? And he'll have a 60% approval rating. Well, then you take the same poll 6 months later, and what do you think of Barack Obama? Only 40% like him. So people change their minds a lot. And so because we need government to provide order and certainty, it helps if we have a group of people in charge, one or more, who have this figured out and have a particular philosophy that they're trying to implement, rather than just rely on popular opinion, because that is fairly changeable from moment to moment sometimes. And so rightly or wrongly, our founding fathers were afraid that if they expanded that power base too much, that allowed the people into it to too large a degree, that it might lead to instability, because people tend to be changeable. They change their minds on stuff. And so people get swept up by the passions of the moment. They get all excited about something or all angry about something, and they would make rash decisions, and they would change their minds too much, and so that would lead to instability at the cost of order and certainty. So those are a couple of reasons why we don't have a pure democracy in the modern world today. Well, we may not live in a pure democracy, but we certainly have democratic elements in our system of government. We're a republic, but we're a democratic republic. One of those elements is that the ultimate power resides in the people. And certainly the people of the United States may not get to vote on every single law all of the time. We elect people to do that for us most of the time. But we do get to go to the polls and elect the people who are making those decisions. We have the ultimate power. And so like a democracy, that ultimate power resides in the people themselves rather than some small group or even one person like in a monarchy. The ultimate power resides in the people. We also have political equality. In olden times, there were dukes and earls and, the upper crust aristocracies who, just by being born into a particular family, they had more political power, more rights than other people had. And we don't have that in a democracy. And certainly we don't have that in the United States. If you are a citizen of the United States, you're equal to every other citizen. So we have that political equality. We don't have people that are born with more power than other people. And so that's an element, a democratic element that made its way into our system of government. We also are built on the idea of majoritarianism. That is, what the most of the people want, that's what we're going to do most of the time. So we take majority votes, and if more people vote for the Republican than vote for the Democrat, then the Republican wins the election. Just things as simple as that. And so we let the will of the people be expressed this way, and whatever the majority of people want, that's what we normally do. And so that's a very democratic principle. Before we go any further here, I think it's a good place to stop and talk about some terms that we'll be seeing since we're talking about majoritarianism. First of all, when we're talking about like election results or something like that, sometimes you'll see a term called a simple majority. A simple majority just means that there's 50% plus 1. So if you count up all the votes, to get a simple majority, you have to have at least half of the votes plus 1 more. So more than half. That's a simple majority. And we'll see that term crop up quite a bit. And so I want to go ahead and get that out of the way here. Sometimes we'll have an extraordinary majority or a supermajority. More than 50% plus 1 is really all we're talking about. It's just something more than that. It could be 2/3. For example, in the United States Senate, in order to ratify a treaty, we have to pass it by a 2/3 vote. Or to override a veto, we'll look at that later on. When we look at the Congress, you have to have 2/3 in both houses of Congress agree to that. But it happens in other places, like in Missouri, when you're passing a school bond issue, you have to have a 4/7 majority, which I'm not that good at math. It works out to something more than 50%. But anyway, anything more than a simple majority is an extraordinary majority, and we'll see those crop up once in a while too. Finally, you might have a situation called a plurality. Plurality happens when you have somebody gets more votes than everyone else, but they don't have 50% plus 1. And so you may have, for instance, a 3-way race, and somebody, for example, gets 40% of the vote, and the other 2 candidates each get 30%. And so you have 100% total, but you don't have anyone getting 50% plus 1, but that 40%, that's a plurality. That person got more votes than all the others, but not a simple majority. So those are 3 terms that you'll see later on, so I'm going to go ahead and get those out of the way while we're talking about majoritarianism. So sorry to shoehorn that in there like that, but helpful to know, I think, as we go forward. Well, speaking of majoritarianism, our founding fathers saw inherent problems with that. First of all, there's no protection for minorities. So if 60% of the people want to oppress the other 40%, there's really nothing to prevent that unless they built in some safeguards. And so majoritarianism might not always be a good thing, which is kind of counterintuitive, I think. It seems like the fairest way to go. But if you do have a minority group, and the majority's out to get them, if we just are built solely on majoritarianism, there's nothing to protect that minority group. And so the founding fathers were wise enough that they broke the country up into subgroups to where each group of people basically has their own representatives. And we'll look at how that's structured later on. But let's just take an example of an urban-rural kind of situation to where, let's say that we have the majority of people, which we do anymore in the United States, live in cities. Well, what's good for the city people might not be good for the rural people. And so if we just took a majority vote every time we did something, the city people could always outvote the country people. And so whatever they decided, might not be good for the rural folks. And so the way the Founding Fathers structured things, we have, for instance, congressional districts, and where different people in different areas get to vote on their congressmen. And in southwest Missouri, for example, we have the city of Springfield and Joplin, but most of it's very rural. And so our congressman is usually very sympathetic to the concerns of rural people. And so he and other congressmen from rural areas can be in Washington, D.C., and using their influence to protect the interests of rural folks. And so by having different districts like that, breaking the country up into those little groups that get to elect their own representatives, you can protect the interests of everybody. And so majoritarianism by itself, if it runs amok, it's not going to be a good situation. But we do have some safeguards built in. So, kind of to put a bow on it, I guess, our government, it's a republic, but it does have democratic elements, especially these three. But majoritarianism isn't completely unleashed. We do have some safeguards to protect minority groups from being oppressed. So our system of government, it embodies democratic principles, but it's not a pure democracy. We saw what a pure democracy is, and we don't have that. We have a democratic republic. Our people are divided into groups, usually by geography, to choose representatives or run a government with their interests in mind. Those representatives form a temporary elite, which make decisions that bind the entire community. So we elect our congressman, our president, whoever it is, to go and create laws, to execute laws and all that stuff, to carry out those functions of government. They're not a permanent elite. Back in the olden times, again, we'd have dukes and earls and people who were born into those positions, and they would always be the elite, and the rest of us would just be peons. Well, that's not how it works in our country. We select a temporary elite every time we go and vote. We'll send someone to Washington, D.C. or Jefferson City to work on our behalf, but as soon as they're out of office, they just go back to being a normal citizen. So a little bit different than how it used to be through much of world history. Pure democracy gives a lot of freedom, but not a lot of order and stability, and so that's why we can't have it. It's cumbersome, but it doesn't really do the functions of government that we need it to do, because it's so cumbersome. We can't make decisions easily. It's inflexible, and if the will of the people is left unchecked, it might be too unstable to really provide that order and stability that we need. So we can't have a pure democracy, but we have as much democracy built into our system as we really can. Our Founding Fathers struck that balance between the freedom and democracy and order. They had to come up with a way to give us as much freedom as they possibly could, a democratic form of government, but also to provide the order and stability that we needed to have civilization, to have a successful country. And so really the rest of the course is we're going to be looking at how they came up with that balance. How did they manage to give us that order and stability that we needed, but also give us the freedoms that we enjoy. And so I think they did a pretty good job at that. And it was pretty ingenious, especially for its time. And so that's really what we're going to be looking at in the remainder of the course. Before we do that, though, we're going to take a little bit more of a detour into philosophies of government, so bear with me. Well, now what we're going to start looking at is where it really shapes our preferences for one form of government over another. We've looked at several different forms. Well, what causes us to choose one of those forms? What kind of shapes our philosophy of government? Well, the first thing we're going to look at is what we call ideology. And ideology is basically a framework for your thinking. It's a set of core beliefs that shapes the way you look at the world, and it's the lens through which you see what's going on around you, a set of very basic beliefs. Another way of defining it is as a preset disposition towards certain subjects. In other words, that's the lens through which you see the world. When you see something happening, you'll interpret those events a certain way because of your ideology. Your neighbor may interpret it a slightly different way, but these core beliefs influence how you look at the world and, in turn, how you believe that government should function. Let's look at an example of that. For example, if you have a fundamental belief that the government should stay out of your life as much as possible, we probably all know folks, especially in this area, that feel that way. Well, every time you hear about another government program starting up, what are you going to think? Are you going to be like, oh, yay, another government program? Well, no. If your fundamental belief is that government should be small as possible and stay out of your life, you're going to be thinking, oh, no, here they come again. They're going to be meddling in my life. They're going to make my taxes go up. So your ideology leads you to believe that that's bad news. But if your neighbor has a different ideology, and hears that the government's starting some new program, he may be thinking, yay, another government benefit. And so ideology shapes how you interpret that news. And so that ideology is that set of basic beliefs that really kind of colors your view of the world, including your view of what government ought to be doing and how it should function. Now we're going to look at some different ideologies that we deal with, and this is probably a gross oversimplification, but I think it kind of helps us understand what's going on in the political spectrum. In American politics, we can really concentrate on two key questions that'll help us define different political ideologies. The first question we're going to look at is, to what extent should government be involved in our personal liberties? In other words, how much should government be telling you what you can and can't do as you go about your daily life? In order to carry out its job, its very basic job of bringing order to society, we already talked about that freedom and order are opposites. That in order to carry out this responsibility, the government has to bring order. In order to bring order, the government must curtail freedom to some degree. But there's a difference of opinion on what degree of curtailing that freedom is really appropriate. And different people have different opinions on that, on how much government ought to get involved in that. And so that's a key question that helps us define different political ideologies. And as an example issue that we can look at, there's the hot button political issue of abortion. This has been a very intensely debated issue in American politics for at least the last 40 years or so. And different opinions that we might hear, such as this one from person one, is that government has no place telling a woman what she can do with her own body. Certainly that's one basic viewpoint. We usually label it pro-choice, that a woman's body is her body, and what's going on in her body is her business and no one else's. The government needs to stay out of that. Can't tell her what she can and can't do with her uterus. And so that's person one's viewpoint here, but a different person might have a completely different viewpoint, such as government has a responsibility to protect the life of an unborn child. The sanctity of life, therefore, is something that the government must uphold. That's an important principle that the government needs to be involved in. And so the government can tell the woman what to do in order to protect that very important interest. And so we might have different people have very different viewpoints about this important issue. So continuing with our example here, we can label folks with different ideologies about government. But I can't caution you enough that whenever we're putting people into little boxes here, trying to categorize them, people are individuals and no two people are alike. And so when we're going around labeling ideologies and that sort of thing, it's important to realize that no two people think exactly alike. We can't fit people into neat little boxes. So what we're going to do here is just kind of try to help us make sense of the political universe a little bit by using some of these labels. But please realize that you can't go around labeling people with certain ideologies. It just doesn't work that way. It's also kind of rude because people are individuals, and just because they may be conservative on most things, they may be liberal on other things, and so people are individuals. But having said that, with that asterisk, we will continue and try to kind of fill out our little universe of political ideologies here. So when it comes to the issue of government involvement in personal liberties, like the issue we just looked at on abortion, we can say that a person who is liberal is more inclined to keep government out of people's personal lives and let the people do whatever they want. And so a liberal person is more inclined to just live and let live. People can do what they want to do. The government, shouldn't be telling them, what they can do in their personal life, typically. So that's a generalization, but one that we can adopt here, at least for the sake of argument for now. On the contrary, a conservative person typically believes the government should be involved in curtailing personal freedom if, and that's an important if, a universal moral principle is at stake. And so, again, we can talk about our example we just looked at of abortion. When in that example, the liberal person might be person one, who would say that, well, the government has no place telling a woman what she can do with her own uterus. The government needs to stay out of that. And most people, I think, if you took a survey who identify themselves as liberal, would be pro-choice in today's America. That's just kind of how it is. On the other hand, a conservative would say, well, there's a universal moral principle at stake here. That's the sanctity of life. And so we can't let somebody terminate that life. The government needs to get involved and stop them from doing that. And so we'll curtail their personal freedom because there's an important moral principle here that we need to uphold. Other examples, maybe the gay marriage debate, whereas a liberal would say, well, what's the government doing, telling people who they can love and who they can't and who they can spend their life with? Let's stay out of that and let them do whatever they want to do. A conservative, on the other hand, might be jumping up and down saying, look, there's the sanctity of marriage here. It's an important part of society. It's a universal moral principle that we need to, government needs to defend the definition of marriage and keep it from being changed in this way. And so gay folks shouldn't be able to marry each other. Again, we kind of see that dichotomy there. Drug legalization is another example. A liberal might think, if it's not hurting anyone else, the government ought to just let people smoke what they want to smoke or whatever. Whereas a conservative, would say, no, this is, society, needs to be protected from this horrible, evil of illegal drugs. And so we shouldn't let people going around getting high because that, there's something wrong with that. There's a universal moral principle at stake here. And, as much as we might like personal freedom, on a normal day, here, there's a principle at stake. The government needs to get involved in that. So you can kind of see how this dichotomy breaks down in these different examples. And so if you're a visual thinker here, I have a little diagram where the level of government influence on personal liberties, we have less, we have more, and we can put the liberals on the less side and the conservatives on the more side. So, at least in certain situations, the conservatives are more willing to get government involved in people's personal lives to keep them from doing bad stuff if there's a universal moral principle at stake, whereas a liberal, in general terms, is more likely to think, just live and let people do whatever they want to do as long as they're not hurting anyone else. And so that's one distinction that we can draw there. We've already seen the first question that defines political ideology, how much the government should be involved in our personal liberties. The second major question is how much the government should be involved in regulating the economy. There are really three major schools of thought on this, which have been expressed different ways throughout history. One is the market economy or capitalism. And this is what we have in the United States. In a market economy, private owners own the means of production, that is, the factories, the things that are making goods and services, producing stuff, as well as the distribution. And so where the stuff gets shipped to isn't controlled by the government, it's controlled by market forces, supply and demand. If you've ever taken economics, you'll know what that is. But basically, these invisible forces of the market are what sets the prices for goods and services, can kind of figures out where the flow goes. And so if there's a tightening in the demand, an increase in demand for a product, its price will tend to go up. If the supply will shrink, then the price goes up. But if there's more supply or less demand, the price will go down. And those are the things that really drive our economy, the invisible market forces. And pretty much the government just kind of stays out of the way. And it's a referee on the sidelines, just kind of making sure everything, goes okay. There is some regulation. For instance, we don't let factories dump pollution into rivers and stuff just because it's cheaper, that kind of stuff. We don't allow monopolies and things, which we'll look at a little bit more down the road sometime. But there is some regulation of business, but pretty much the government kind of stays out of the way and just lets the economy hum along on its own. And most democracies are like this. For the most part, they are based on a market economy. Well, the polar opposite of a market economy is what communists like to do. Under communism, the government owns the means of production and distribution. Other than, just kind of personal goods, there's really no private property. And that is, the government owns all the factories, the government owns all the businesses, and everyone who has a job is a government employee. And there's central planning of the economy. Rather than let the market figure out what the economy is going to do, the government will plan ahead. And so rather than just let prices and market forces determine how much steel is going to be produced in a particular year, the government will say, okay, this year we're going to produce this many tons of steel, and this is what we're going to do with it. And so the government is controlling all aspects of the economy pretty much, has its fingers into everything. And under the old Soviet Union, this is what happened. China is nominally communist, although they have a lot of market reforms these days. But like North Korea, which is a communist dictatorship, The government pretty much owns everything. Any private enterprise that goes on is kind of on the fringes of the economy and sometimes below the radar and maybe illegal, because the government really owns everything and controls everything. So those are really the two extremes that we can have. Somewhere in the middle is socialism. And this is kind of a mix where much of the economy is in private hands, but the government has significant control and may even own some major industries. And when the government owns an industry, we say that it's been nationalized. And a good example of this is in Venezuela. And in Venezuela, a major part of their economy is the oil industry. And they had a socialist named Chavez who came to power about 15 years ago. And he nationalized the oil industry, which means that there were private oil companies operating down there, and he just came in and said, okay, the government owns all this now. And all the oil workers became government employees. And I'm not sure if the companies that had owned all that stuff got any compensation or not. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the government just came in and said, okay, this is a major aspect of our economy, a major sector, and so we're just going to take it over, and the government runs it. And so in a socialist system, a lot of the economy is in private hands, but some key sectors of it may be nationalized and taken over by the government. So it's a little bit of a mixture between those two extremes. Well, those are the three major schools of thought. If we go back and look at the U.S. economy, we are capitalist, as we already mentioned, but the government does regulate some stuff. There is a heated debate about how much regulation is actually appropriate, and we've gone back and forth on this. Once upon a time, for instance, the government was heavily regulating the airline industry and controlled prices and how many airlines there could be and that kind of thing. Then in the 80s, it deregulated that industry and kind of got out of the way, and some of the airlines folded, some others merged, and new ones started, and the telephone company kind of went through that too. There used to just be AT&T, and then it got broken up into the little Bell companies, and then it changed again. And so our government has gotten involved in the economy at different points, but by and large, we're a market economy that operates under the principles of capitalism. We just use the government to kind of regulate the rough edges of that, make sure, again, that people aren't dumping toxic waste into the lakes and that kind of thing, that the companies aren't cheating consumers and having unfair business practices and stuff like that. So the government is just kind of a referee on the sidelines rather than trying to control the whole thing. Well, liberals and conservatives have different opinions about how involved the government really ought to be in regulating the economy. That's the second major question. So we'll look at their opinions momentarily. Well, looking at our old friends, liberals and conservatives, how do they answer the question, to what extent should government be involved in the economy? Well, by and large, conservatives want to keep the government out of the economy as much as possible. They just want to let the market forces kind of go where they will. And they recognize that there are winners and losers in a market economy. Some people are going to lose their shirts if they make bad decisions. Some people are going to make good decisions and become really rich. And that's really what drives our system. If you think about it, people are always trying to better themselves, or trying to get a better job, make more money, start a business, be able to retire someday. And so that desire to be successful is kind of what drives the market economy. And so the conservatives want the government to stay out of the way of that. Just let the people who make dumb decisions lose, let the people who make good decisions win and get rich, and just let the market forces kind of control what goes on, and without trying to distort that with government regulations. And as we said, in this system, bad decisions are punished. If you are an idiot and you get in charge of a company, you run that company into the ground and lose your shirt, that's you got what you deserve because you made bad decisions. And likewise, good decisions are going to be rewarded by the market. You'll make money. And the philosophy here is, in the long run, the market's going to take care of itself. The market will adjust. If people are making really bad decisions, a company may go bankrupt, but then somebody else will come along and start making widgets and that are even better than that old company, and everyone ends up prospering in the end. And so that's really the idea, that we just kind of let things play themselves out. The market forces will take care of themselves, supply and demand and all that. The government really doesn't need to get involved in that. Doesn't need to protect bad decision makers from their bad decisions and their consequences. Doesn't really need to get in the way of people who are trying to make good decisions. And so the government just kind of needs to stay out of things. On the other hand, most liberals believe in a market economy, and they're not communists, they're not socialists, they're not thinking the government needs to own everything, but they do think the government needs to take a more active role in smoothing out the rough spots. For example, let's say that there's a large company failing. We saw that happen in the financial crisis back around 2008 and 9, where the car companies, General Motors, for example, was threatening to go bankrupt. Well, the government ended up stepping in and giving them a bunch of money so that they wouldn't go out of business. Well, why would they do that? Well, we didn't want that car company to go out of business and all their workers to lose their jobs, because that would be a real detriment to our entire country. And so the liberal thinking folks were more inclined to want to step in, use the power of government, use tax money to keep that company afloat, to protect those jobs. And so liberals are much more ready to use the power of government to help, I'm sorry to use this term, but the losers in the economy. They're going to be winners and losers. And so sometimes people make bad decisions and they might go bankrupt or something. And liberals are more ready to use the power of government to kind of protect those folks. And a good example of this is the housing crisis that we had a few years ago, about, like I said, 2008-ish. Somewhere in there. And in the housing crisis, a lot of people had bought homes with mortgages on bad terms where the interest rates were way too high, and they ended up, the housing prices were in a bubble, and then the bubble collapsed, and so people ended up owing more on their houses than they were worth, and so a lot of people were unable to move. They couldn't sell their house for what they owed because they owed more than the house was worth, and people were in a bad fix. And if you really want to be brutally honest about it, a lot of people made really poor decisions. They paid too much for houses. They took out loans they shouldn't have taken out with interest rates that were too high and all that. And a conservative in that situation would say, what, people made stupid decisions and they ought to suffer the consequences. Because they made that decision, they ought to live with the consequences of that. We shouldn't step in and save them from their bad decisions. But the more liberal thinking folks were like, these poor people, they might have made a mistake, but we should have compassion on them. And more than that, if we let them go belly up, then that's going to hurt everyone else. And so we need to use the power of the government to step in and give them some kind of relief. And so you see that debate on how much the government really ought to be involved in stopping those market forces or kind of cushioning their impact. And that's really what the debates that we see between liberals and conservatives in our economy today. No one really wants, not in the mainstream political discourse anyway, wants to make our country communist or anything like that. But there is a healthy debate about how much the government ought to be stepping in and just preventing market forces from doing things that we don't like once in a while. The conservatives would just let those forces do what they want to do. The liberal thinking folks would want to just kind of step in and cushion the blow with some of that stuff. So that's our contrast between liberals and conservatives on the economy. Well, continuing our look at this question and how different folks answer it, we can look at one situation in American history that really kind of puts into perspective the liberal conservative viewpoints on this question. And that's the Great Depression, which happened started in 1929 and went through pretty much the entire 1930s until World War II. And we'd had depressions before in American history. This was undoubtedly the worst, but every once in a while the economy would have a great big downturn, and there would be, people would lose their homes and their farms and their businesses and be out of work, and it would be horrible. And the economy would kind of sort itself out and take off again. Well, in the Great Depression, it was worse than anyone had ever seen before. But the conservatives were pretty content to let the economy sort itself out with relatively little government intervention into it. And, their thought process was that, okay, the economy, went south, but that happens once in a while. We have booms, we have busts. There are good times and they're bad. We'll just ride this out and let the economy correct itself. The weak companies will go out of business and people will be out of work for a while, but the strong companies will survive and they'll hire the people that were out of work, and things will just kind of keep going. And so they were willing to do some things to kind of help the situation out, but for the most part they wanted to let the government stay out of the way and let nature kind of take its course with the economy at that time. But that was one viewpoint. Liberals, however, didn't share that view, and they wanted to use the massive power of the federal government to really intervene in the economy in a big way. And we saw that happen. The conservatives, or actually the Republican Party, had been in office for a while, holding the presidency. And Herbert Hoover was the president, who was a Republican when the Depression started. He lost the election in a landslide because people really wanted to try something different. And they said, we're not willing to wait to see if things correct itself. We want somebody who'll come in and try something new. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president. And he came to power and with a more liberal philosophy. And was very willing to use the power of the federal government. We saw all kinds of big government programs start in those years to kind of soften the blow. And so we saw things like Social Security to help the old folks, give them some kind of income in their golden years. And we saw the government start massive public works projects, building dams and highways and bridges and stuff like that. And, it was great to have dams, highways, and bridges, but the real purpose of that was to give people who were out of work a job. And so they were using that massive power of the federal government to really intervene in the economy in a big way and pump money into the economy and make sure that people had money to buy food and that kind of thing. And so they were really, really wanting to use the massive power of the government to kind of give a kickstart to the economy. And so we've seen that debate kind of play out at other times in our history since then, too. And again, recently, in 2008 to 9 or so, we saw, you may remember, the stimulus, where the Democrats were in charge of most things in Washington, and they pushed through this massive bill where the government spent a huge amount of money trying to pump that into the economy to get, the economy moving again, so businesses would start hiring people and unemployment would go down and that kind of thing. And that's a very liberal thing to do, to try to use the power of the government to kind of jumpstart the economy, to, help unemployment and all that kind of stuff, too. So we see that kind of play itself out from time to time whenever the economy kind of hits a rough patch. Okay, well, let's revisit the kind of graphic that we had earlier. Remember, we had on question 1 about personal liberties, we had a little graph showing where the liberals and conservatives kind of came out on that. Well, we can have another graph here dealing with the government influence in the economy. And again, we have less on the left and more on the right. Well, this time, we see the conservatives on the left-hand side. They're on wanting less government interference. And remember, they wanted more government interference on the other side, on the other chart, dealing with personal liberties. And as long as an important moral principle was involved, they were quite willing to get the government involved in that. So very different for them. And likewise, on the old chart, the liberals didn't want the government being involved in personal liberties really much at all. But over here, they're much more willing to have the government involved in the economy. And so our two friends, conservatives and liberals, have kind of flipped positions here, haven't they? The liberals are more willing to get the government involved, and the conservatives want them to be less involved. So we kind of have just a 180-degree turn here in terms of how involved the government will get in this issue. So liberals and conservatives have kind of switched places here. Well, now that we've looked at both of these basic questions, let's try to put these two graphs together. Let me take a moment to pause and apologize if you hate math, because I can sympathize with that. Math doesn't really like me very much either. But what we're going to do here is going to look a lot like analytic geometry. So I'm sorry if the X and Y axis kind of gives you cold sweats or something, but I think it makes a lot more sense if we kind of put these two things together to kind of see how this breaks out. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the first graph that we looked at dealing with personal liberty, and we're going to make that our x-axis, basically, on our graph here. And then we're going to take the economy graph that we just did, that little chart on the prior slide, we're going to make that our y-axis. And so we're going to put these two things together where we have the level of government influence. So you can see there on the horizontal axis we have personal liberty, less government interference on the left, more on the right. The economy, we have more government interference on the top, we have less on the bottom. And so now, where do our faithful friends, liberals and conservatives, fit into this? Well, we know that liberals want less interference with personal liberty and more interference in the economy, so we're going to put them there in that upper left quadrant of our little graph. And likewise, conservatives want more interference in personal liberties, assuming that there's some kind of principle at stake that they're willing to protect. But they want much less government interference in the economy. And so we'll put them in that lower right-hand quadrant. And so here we have kind of a view of looking at the world here, of classifying different ideologies. And so we can kind of see how these two things, when we put them together, they kind of break out. Before we go forward, one note, sometimes you may hear in political discourse that someone will accuse someone of being left-wing or right-wing or a leftist or something like that. Those terms are historic terms, and they actually came from the era of Napoleon in France a long time ago, where there was an assembly of basically legislators in France. And anyway, the ones who were more liberal sat on the left-hand side of the room, and the ones who were more conservative sat on the right-hand side of the room. And so they started calling them left wing and right wing, and it just kind of stuck. And so that's how we have it here on our chart. Liberals are considered more left wing, and so they're on the left side of the chart. Conservatives are more right wing, so they're on the right side of the chart. So if you hear that term, left or right, in politics, that's what they're talking about. So I won't really stick with that too much, but wanted you to be familiar with that terminology. All right, well, let's continue our example now by adding some more political ideologies. Liberal and conservative are fairly common and well known, but there are some others out there. So let's revisit our chart here that we just made. It's the exact same chart that was on the prior slide, and we have liberals and conservatives and their little areas of our graph here. Well, you might notice that there's some empty real estate on this little chart, and who lives in those corners where we haven't put anyone yet? Well, libertarians occupy this lower left-hand quadrant, and libertarians really don't want the government being involved in much of anything. They just want to be left alone, pretty much. They don't want the government being involved in their personal liberty. They don't want the government being involved in the economy. They just want the government to kind of stay out of the way, do the things that it needs to do, but let people live their lives without any kind of interference. And so we do have libertarians running around today. Ron Paul, not Rand Paul, but his dad, Ron Paul, who ran for president last time around, I believe, was a famous libertarian who really kind of has some out of mainstream views on some things. He ran as a Republican, but most Republicans are more conservative than libertarian, but they may be kind of a mixture of those two philosophies. So that's an important point too when we're talking about Democrats and Republicans. There may be liberal Democrats and more conservative Democrats or whatever. So don't get political parties confused with ideology. It's kind of a different thing. But anyway, and we'll talk more about that later on. But libertarians are really don't want the government being involved in much of anything in their lives. Well, populists, we can put this label up here in the top right-hand quadrant. Populists really don't want, well, what they really want to do is take from the rich and give to the poor. I guess it's kind of their main driving characteristic. That kind of is what makes them famous. They're really interested in getting more government interference in both of these areas, but they really would like to like I said, take from the rich, give to the poor, and that's very popular. They're trying to look out for the little guy, the masses of people. So that's where they get their name. So that's kind of their philosophy. You don't see that too much in the United States, but we do see it sometimes crop up overseas where somebody wants to get into power and maybe nationalize an industry. And then try to split the profits from, say, the oil industry or whatever industry they want to take over with the common people, and give them a check. And what they might do is they'll use the government's power to keep prices down on things like toilet paper and rice and stuff that people buy every day, and try to help the little guy that way. So that's kind of their driving characteristic. Well, so we have all four quadrants. We have somebody in all of them. But that's really not the end of the story, because we can go to more extremes. And so if we take the whole idea of liberalism, which wants less government interference with personal liberties and more with the economy, and kind of take that a little bit further, we might have folks that we would call radical socialists. And it's just taking liberalism to an extreme. They really don't want any government interference in personal liberty, but they're very, very willing to get the government involved in the economy, maybe to the point of taking over some of the means of production and distribution. And being more socialistic about it. So we can just kind of take that idea a little bit to an extreme there. Conservatives, if we take their ideals a little bit further, a little more extreme, going to the edges of the chart, we would have what might go by different names. Reactionary is one I've seen quite a bit, or ultra-conservative. We'll see that sometimes as well. But that's just taking conservative ideals a little bit further. Really opposed to having government interference in the economy, and more willing, perhaps, to have the government involved in personal liberties a little bit. There's extremes in every political ideology. So if you take conservatives a little bit further, you'll have something called reactionary or ultra-conservative. Populists, if you take their ideas even further, you'll have communists. And they really, really want the government involved in the economy to the point that they want to take over everything, almost every industry. Personal property, almost ceases to exist. They want the government to own everything and every worker to be a government employee. They also want the government involved in personal liberty. They want to shut down opposition. Usually, in communist countries, there's usually only one political party, and that's the Communist Party. And so they're much more willing to use the power of government in every aspect of life. And so that's just taking that to an extreme. Libertarians, if you take that to an extreme, libertarians don't want the government very involved in anything. Well, the people who don't want any government at all are called anarchists. They really don't want any government at all, hardly. Maybe some remnant of it to kind of do some basic things, but they really are opposed to government control of almost anything. And so there we have our chart kind of filled out to where we have somebody populating all the different corners of it. It's important to realize, though, that probably 98% of folks on the political spectrum are pretty near the center. We're not going to see too many communists running around, at least not in the United States today. There are some, there's an American Communist Party, but it's not very common. And likewise, there aren't too many anarchists running around, too many reactionaries, too many radical socialists. Even the people who are liberal and conservative are pretty close to the center of this chart, pretty much. Even libertarians and all usually aren't too far out on the fringes. And so there are some people who, we'd kind of call them fringe dwellers, that are out there on the margins thinking something pretty radical. But they're in a small minority. So even when you're talking about Democrats and Republicans and liberals and conservatives, and you turn on one of the cable news networks and see people screaming at each other about, politics or whatever, they're really not that far apart as far as the grand scheme of things goes. Most of those folks aren't out way on the fringes. Some are more liberal than others, some are more conservative than others, but they're going to usually inhabit the middle of our chart here, pretty close. And if somebody's dead in the middle, they call them a centrist. Usually somebody's a little more on one side than the other, but most people live near in the middle of the graph, and that's kind of where mainstream politics takes place. It's kind of that little pink area that I made there. There's some variation. Some people are more conservative than others, but pretty much the majority of people in the United States today are pretty close to the center of the chart. They're not going to be too radical one way or the other. All right, well, we looked at political ideology, and what we're now going to look at is something that's kind of related to that, but a little bit different. Also, some very basic beliefs, and that's called a paradigm. Just kind of ignore that G that's in there. It's called a paradigm. It's similar, but a little bit different than an ideology. A paradigm describes some central assumptions we have about how the universe works, and they're so basic to our beliefs, they usually go in question. We really don't think about them. It just kind of shapes our whole way of understanding the universe. It's so basic to our belief system. For example, if our core belief is that the Earth is at the center of the universe, which, most people believe that for much of human history, that shapes your whole worldview. That shapes your understanding of the whole universe. Because if the Earth is at the center, then we don't think that the Earth is going around the sun. We think the sun's going around the Earth. There are certain things that flow from that basic assumption that we make about how the universe is put together. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a paradigm. We have those basic assumptions, and then we draw conclusions based upon those assumptions. And that ends up shaping the way that we look at the universe and our core philosophy of how nature works, how things are put together. And so that's what we're going to examine now in relationship to government is a paradigm. Well, in government, there have been really two basic paradigms that have shaped how people believe government should function and whom it should serve. And why is it here? What's government supposed to be doing? Who's it working for? For most of human history, government was based upon the divine right paradigm. And the divine right paradigm held that an ultimate authority to govern flowed from God, or, if not God, some force beyond human experience. That's where we get the power to push people around, to have authority over them, to have that kind of governmental control that brings about that order, predictability, and certainty. And so that's the source. God, or some force beyond human experience, is the ultimate source of power. And from God, it went to the ruler, the king, or whomever is in charge. And the ruler ruled over the people because that was God's will, that he do so. God in his infinite wisdom put this person in charge, gave him the power to run the government. Well, looking at the divine right paradigm in kind of a graphical format, at the top we have God, who is in charge of the universe and decides who is going to be in charge. And in this case, God delegated some of that power to the king. And again, for most of human history, we're dealing with absolute monarchy or some variant on that, where there's basically one person in charge. But it could be any kind of government, but whatever. We're looking at power flowing from God to the government or the king. Then the king uses that power to control the people, and the people are subjects of the king, and that just means they do what they're told. They are subject to the king's power, and so this is a divine right paradigm in a nutshell. Power starts off with God, flows straight to the king, and the king is put there because God wants him there, and so the king gets to tell the people what to do. And that's how the divine right paradigm kind of works out, and that's what people just assumed for much of human history, that this is how the universe works. And this is, as peons, we're just supposed to do what the king tells us because God likes the king and God gave him the power to do that. And we really don't question things, even if the king tells us to do something that's really boneheaded. Well, God wants him there, so we have to put up with it. And that's how people looked at the universe for much of history. Well, some things we need to observe to rule effectively. Any kind of ruler needs both authority and legitimacy. Now, what are we talking about there? Well, authority we can define as the recognized right to exercise power. So somebody is in charge. They have the ability to tell people what to do. They have authority over others, and so everyone recognizes that somebody is in charge. Okay, so somebody has that power. Well, under the divine right model, the ruler got that authority straight from God himself. God gave the king the power to rule over us. And so that was what people just assumed, is that the rulers who are in authority, God put them there, God wants them there, God gave them that power, and so that's why we listen to them. Legitimacy is a little bit different. It's the acceptance of authority as proper by the people who are being ruled over. And so the common people accept the fact that authority is rightfully held by whoever is in charge. And so without any kind of question. And legitimacy is really important because it kept the potential for a rebellion against the ruler to a minimum. So consider what would happen if people didn't think that the king was legitimate. Let's say that somebody like the king had a servant or somebody that stabbed him in the back and then tried to take over, and sat on the throne and tried to push people around. Well, people would see how he came to power and say, well, he shouldn't be in charge. They wouldn't listen to him, and they might revolt. And so legitimacy is really important because it's the acceptance of the people of the ruler as the fact that he ought to be there. And so if they accept that the ruler really ought to be in charge, then they're not going to rebel against him. And so it's important to have that authority and legitimacy. And again, our ruler in the divine right model gets both of those things from God himself. Who in the world is going to question the king's right to rule over you if he gets his authority and his legitimacy straight from God? Nobody wants to go against God. And so if they really thought that God wanted the king to be on the throne, they're not ever going to question him. Because questioning the authority of the ruler would be like questioning God, which is never a good idea. He could smite you. So we don't want lightning to come down and strike us. We don't want to go to hell. We don't want to question, don't want to upset God because God put this person in power. God gave them the authority. That's where they get their legitimacy from. It's straight from God. And so we're not going to question that. And that's how And when people got to be in charge, people just kind of went along with that. And that's why under the divine right paradigm. Okay, well, in the divine right model, it's important to observe that people are not citizens, but subjects. Well, what does that mean? Well, a citizen, if we are in the United States today and we're born here or naturalized, we're a citizen. That means that we have certain rights, and we have a voice in the government. We get to go vote. We get to serve on juries. We get to run for office if we want to. We get to do those sorts of things. We get to participate in our government. And, we're not just being pushed around by the government. We have an active role to play. We have a voice in the government. Well, under the divine right paradigm, people were subjects, which is they just do what they're told. They don't have those rights, unless the king wants to give them some rights. They don't have any rights. They don't get a voice in the government unless the government lets them have a voice. They're subject to the government. So in this model, the job of the people was to obey the ruler and really nothing more. They weren't supposed to be trying to help run things. They were just supposed to be doing what they were told. Because the ruler was exercising God's authority and telling them what to do, and they were supposed to obey that. They weren't born with any rights. They only had the rights that the king chose to give them. So, things that we think of like free speech and freedom of religion and all that kind of stuff that we have in our Constitution, well, you didn't have that. If the king chose to let you worship however you wanted to, good for you, but the king could change his mind at any point in time. So you only had the rights that the king decided to give you. Also, you had no right to question the government of the king or to rebel against him, because to do so would be rebelling against God. We assume God put this person on the throne, gave them that power to rule over us, so we're going to do what they tell us, and we're not going to question that. Because, again, if we did that, we would be questioning God. We'd be rebelling against God, so we're not going to risk the divine wrath there. So that's how government worked. That's how people perceived the universe of government for much of human history. To our modern ears, it sounds kind of strange, I think. Where would people get such a silly idea as this? Well, we don't have to look too far to find out. If we want to look for kind of a philosophical basis for the divine right paradigm, or at least kind of see it encapsulated and fairly concisely in a famous piece of literature, you can go to get your Bible and turn to the Apostle Paul's epistle to the Romans in chapter 13 and beginning in verse 1. We won't do this too often. This is a secular school. We won't open our Bibles every week, but this week we can kind of do that and see where this idea comes from, or at least kind of see how it's expressed in the Bible, which was very influential throughout much of Western civilization for the last 2,000 years. So Romans chapter 13, verse 1, this is New King James, says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities." Why? Well, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. So we have that basic idea, the divine right paradigm. Verse 2, "Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves." So if you question the authority of the ruler, you are questioning God himself, inviting his wrath. Verse 3, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due. Taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." So this is what, in the 1st century AD, the Apostle Paul wrote this down to the church at Rome. And that was kind of a stretch for the Roman church there, because Christianity wasn't looked upon real highly. The Romans were pagans and they were in charge. But he's telling them, look, the emperor of Rome, he's there because God put him there. And you need to obey his authority, pay him taxes, do whatever else he wants you to do. So if you're questioning the right of the rulers to rule, you're questioning God. So this really, in a nutshell, is kind of the philosophy of the divine right paradigm. So because Christianity became part of Western culture about 2,000 years ago, and kind of became ingrained in everything, this idea became ingrained in people too. And so for many centuries, this whole divine right paradigm really went without question. That the people who were in charge were there because God wanted them there, and as the normal residents of the country, our job was just to obey the rulers and really not to question what they were doing. So that really ruled the philosophy of government for a really long time. Well, it took a few hundred years of philosophical and sometimes military struggle, but we no longer accept the divine right paradigm in our system or most other modern systems of government. So we've moved on to something else. The basic idea, the divine right paradigm, has been under attack for a long time in some quarters. Even the ancient Greeks, and Aristotle, who were philosophers back in those days, they didn't all agree with the divine right paradigm. And so there's a long history of questioning it. But it came under heavy assault during the Renaissance, particularly John Locke, who was a philosopher in England, put forth a couple of basic ideas which kind of flew in the face of this whole divine right idea that really started to gain traction. One was that people are born with natural rights. What does that mean? Well, just by virtue of the fact that you're a human being who is born on this earth, you're endowed with certain rights that no one can take away. And that was kind of revolutionary because, up until then, everyone had just kind of thought, well, the king gives us rights and the king takes away rights, and whatever rights he decides to give us is what we have. But Locke's idea was no, just because you are born, God created you and he created you with certain rights. And so no one can take those rights away because you're born with them and they're yours. So that idea of natural rights, that was kind of a real difference from what the divine right paradigm had held. A second thing that he came up with was all legitimate governing authority is based upon the consent of the governed, which was a real revolutionary idea. The idea here is that the rule of government is not legitimate and proper unless the government is approved of by the people, which is not what the divine right held at all. The people were subjects there, and they just were supposed to do what they were told. Well, here Locke says, government is really not legitimate unless the people really approve of the government. And so that was a whole new concept, that the people's opinion mattered at all about their government. So a very different idea entirely. Well, Locke's philosophy ended up replacing the divine right paradigm with a new paradigm, one called the social contract. The new model kept one thing the same. Power still flowed from some authority beyond human experience, God, if you will. So that's where power comes from. But instead of power flowing from God straight to the ruler, it now flowed from God to the people and from the people to the government. So again, we have God at the top of our heap here as a source of ultimate authority, but he delegates that not to the ruler, but to the people. And the people are citizens. They're not just subjects. They actually participate in the governmental process. They have a say in things. So that's a different idea entirely. Then the people choose a government to do their work for them and take care of them and that sort of thing. And so it's flipped those two people on the bottom of the pile there. Instead of having the ruler and then the people, we have the people and then the ruler. And so the people, as citizens, have a right to have a voice in their government. So again, a very different idea. Well, looking at the social contract, several characteristics, observations we can make about it. The ruler is no longer sovereign. The people are. Sovereign is an old French word that just kind of means having ultimate authority in some form or fashion. And kings and queens were called sovereigns in the olden days. Under the divine right paradigm, the ruler was sovereign. They had the ultimate ruling authority. Well, under the social contract, they don't. It's the people that have that ultimate ruling authority. They are given the power by God to choose their rulers or system of government. So they don't have to put up with a ruler they don't like. They should have the power to choose whatever government they want. That kind of changes the whole mindset here, because instead of being something imposed on us from God, government becomes an artificial construct that the people create to suit their needs. And so instead of being imposed on us from above, government is something that we figure out what we want and we create it and we put it in place, and then later if we want to change it, we can. So Very different. And instead of the people serving the government is the servant of the people. So the people should be masters of the government. And, we get to go vote and pick who's in charge. If we want to change the government, we can rewrite the Constitution if we want to. And that's the idea that the people are in charge, not the government. The government is supposed to serve the people, not the other way around. The government is really created solely to serve the people. It doesn't have any other reason for existing, really, than to do the people's will, to protect them, to do the services that they want done, that sort of thing. So that's why the government is there, is to serve the people. The people create it, and it's created to serve the people. In return, though, the people agree to do certain things for the government, provide the government certain things that it needs to govern effectively. And this is the basic idea of the social contract. The government does things for the people, and the people do things for the government. Let's take a closer look at that. Under the social contract model, if we want to draw another picture, we have the government on one side, we have the people on the other, and both of these entities are doing certain things for each other. The people give certain things to the government. For instance, people pay taxes. The government can't do its work unless it has money in the bank. And so the people pay taxes to the government. They agree to do that. The people owe obedience to the government. They're not going to be treasonous, and sell it out to its enemies or whatever. They're going to obey the laws that are passed in the land. They're going to exhibit some kind of loyalty to the government. They're not going to sell it out again, be a turncoat and support the government's enemies. Or whatever, and as needed, they'll participate in the government. In a democratic system, people can run for office, people serve on juries, people go vote. We have to play an active role in the government, or it won't work. So, under the social contract, the people do owe certain things to the government. They agree to do this. It's not that they're forced to do it, and they are, in a sense. If you don't pay taxes, you'll go to jail. But the idea is that at some point in the past, the people as a whole have agreed to do this. As part of a bargain. Well, as the other half of the bargain, the government provides things to the people. What does the government provide? Well, order, security, and maybe even certain services. So it does those basic things, the order, predictability, and certainty that we looked at earlier. It makes sure that we have a lawful environment, that there's not chaos, that there's firefighters to fight fires, there's police to keep order. There's a military to protect us from invasion, those sorts of things. So it provides those sorts of services. It also may provide other services, maybe, some, now we have government health insurance and stuff like that. We have Social Security, we have Medicaid and Medicare and stuff like that. We have, trash pickup and, you name it. And the government does certain things for us. And so here, though, we see it's a two-way street. The government provides certain things to us as the people, and in return, we provide certain things to the government. So under the divine right paradigm, it was really a top-down thing. The government does whatever it wants, and the people say, okay, and that's really all that there is to it. Well, here, it's very different. The people create the government in order to provide these services, and in return, the people agree to do certain things on the government's behalf. So that's the basic model of the social contract. Well, under the social contract, some more observations we can make about it. First of all, it is a two-way street, as we already pointed out. The people have to give certain things to the government gives certain things to the people. It's not just a master-servant type relationship. It's kind of almost a relationship of equals. We strike a bargain with the government. We contract for the things it gives us, and give it certain things in return. So, at some point in the past, we can kind of assume that there was some sort of agreement, like when our Constitution was adopted. The people adopted the Constitution, created the government, so it could provide certain services, and in return they agreed to pay their taxes and do the other things that they were supposed to do. We authorize the government to punish us if we violate our terms of the deal. So if we don't pay our taxes, if we're not loyal to the government, if we violate the laws that we authorize it to make, we, by our consent, allow the government to punish us if we violate our terms of the deal there. And this is truly revolutionary, is that the people can terminate the contract if the government fails in its responsibilities. Remember, the people create the government, and it basically exists because the people want it to. And the revolutionary, literally, thing that that Locke came up with is that, the people can change their minds. If the government's not working for them, they can terminate that contract and come up with some other system of government. Because it's really, it didn't come from God, it came from the people. So if the people want to change it, by golly, they can change it. And so that was completely, 180 from what people had thought under the divine right paradigm, where the government was imposed on them by God, and only God could change it. Well, here the people have the power to change the government because they're in charge ultimately. And so since that government is an artificial construct, if it's not doing its job, the people have every right to get rid of it, replace it with something else if it's not doing its job. And so, therefore, the people have the right to overthrow their government if it no longer suits their needs. So that's very, very different from the divine right paradigm. And you can understand why, the kings and those who were in charge under the, with the divine right paradigm having ruled the day for so long, they would have been very nervous about this. And in fact, in the 19th century, we started seeing revolutions start to happen, especially earlier than that, even the French Revolution, where they overthrew their king and eventually executed him. This was a whole great big change in people's thinking, that they could get rid of the government they didn't like and put something else in its place. And so this really couldn't have been more different than the divine right paradigm if it had tried. It's a whole new way of thinking. Well, the idea of the social contract and related philosophies to that really influenced our founding fathers profoundly. Back when we were still British colonies and we were thinking about revolting against our king during the American Revolution and all of that, the whole idea of the social contract was very influential. And our founding fathers eloquently spelled out the ideas of the social contract when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. It kind of gave the finger to King George back in England and said, we don't want you as our king anymore, we're going to replace you with something else. Now that was very much a social contract kind of thing to do. And so what they intended to do was by issuing the Declaration of Independence, declaring America an independent country, they're trying to get rid of a government that wasn't working for them anymore. Which happened to be the King of England, and replace it with a new government, and then make a new country, a government that they created here to serve their needs. So again, very much a social contract kind of idea. Well, let's look at the Declaration of Independence, or the start of it anyway, and I think we'll kind of see these ideas percolating in there. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay, well, there's our natural rights. Unalienable just means no one can take them away, which is what the natural rights idea was. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So governments are created by men, not God, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Again, we allow governments to rule over us because we want them to, not because they have any power from God or anything, but because we create them to do that. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. And that's the revolutionary part of the social contract idea, is that we create government, and if it's not serving our needs, we can get rid of it. And to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And so this is what really we were doing in the American Revolution. It was about a lot of different things, but certainly it was a clash of philosophies, because on the one hand we had the British government, which was still kind of hanging on to that divine right model, and here we had these rebellious colonists who were totally bought into the social contract and said, we don't like your government, we don't want your government, we're going to replace it with something else, thank you very much. And so that was kind of the ideological clash, if you will, that happened during the American Revolution. So again, the philosophy of Locke is clearly evident in the Declaration of Independence. King George is informed by his rebellious colonists that people have natural rights which cannot be taken away. He doesn't have any power to take away their rights. We don't get our rights from the king. We get them because we're born with them. God gives them to us. The king was also told that government is formed by the people to serve their needs, not the other way around, which would have been a rude awakening to the king, no doubt. They explained that when government ceases to be useful, the people have the right to do away with it and find something else, some other system. This revolutionary new idea sparked all kinds of conflict, intellectual and otherwise. It also caused some shooting. So it was, in the most literal sense, it was revolutionary. And so the American Revolution was not only a clash of arms, but also a clash of paradigms. Very different ideas were on the march back in the 1770s and later on. So it wasn't just something mundane about taxes. And we're going to look much more carefully about the American Revolution in the next material that we're going to cover, because I think it's really important to understand really how we got to the Constitution. We really have to understand what all was going on, and if you ever had American history, and I assume you had, on some level, you may have heard that, the American Revolution was all about taxes. Well, taxes had something to do with it, but it wasn't really the root cause. It wasn't all that was going on, because we see that there's also a huge clash of ideas here that was going on. The old way was giving way to the new. And the social contract was coming in, and people had these revolutionary ideas that government needed to be able to serve them, that they could get rid of a government they didn't like, and all that. So that's it for this week. We're going to, like I said, spend some more time looking at American history in a little bit of detail as we cover Chapter 2, and kind of see how this played out and how we ended up with the Constitution that we have today. But this, I think, will give you some pretty good background information on really the philosophy that was going on behind the scenes. So until next week, take care. I'll talk to you then.